I am American, but I am a PhD candidate at the University of Lisboa. But this research that I did was actually done last year in the UK as part of my master's dissertation. So, just quick show of hands, is everybody familiar with the no natural disasters? It's our social systems. Great. I'm going to skip over that then, but it is important. So I wanted to look at queer vulnerability of flooding disasters. There are definitely some gaps in the disaster studies research space about queer experiences of disaster vulnerability and impacts. Disaster studies, as you may know, rely a lot on case studies, so they can be kind of sporadic and scattered, and it's an area where the literature is sort of still building up and catching up. So there's definitely some room to grow there. A lot of it's focused on identifying places where queer intersectional vulnerability interacts with disaster structures and hazards. I'm going to try to push a little bit beyond that, so just foreshadowing. So the main methodology that I used here was serious gaming. This is sort of an emerging approach that I would like to share with all of you. It has, I think, a lot of potential as a participatory method, social learning method. It has a lot of utility, I think, for co-design and community engagement on climate and disaster adaptations. So the two main things that I want to talk about today are this serious gaming approach and vulnerability. I'm saying that out loud to myself because I had a dream last night that I got up here and I burned through all of my time talking and somehow didn't mention any of my key points. So I'm staying focused. So the game that I used was actually adapted from the flood recovery game. This was initially developed by my supervisor, Dr. Forrest. This is a picture from his team's research. You can see the board game there. I started off with the board game, but through this co-creative process, by the end of it, I was just left with these cards. So I won't bore you with the exact rules of gameplay or anything, but it basically worked a little bit like Cards Against Humanity. Players were given a flooding scenario and they had to play resource cards and narrate how they would use them and then discuss that. During that exercise, they were also asked to write down on Post-it notes gaps, challenges, issues that came up in those discussions. So things like homelessness, queer exclusionary services. The literature reflects that, queer people facing disaster impacts can face violence in evacuation shelters. They can be denied aid by religious organizations. They can be excluded from funding due to different family statuses. So there's lots of different things going on there. And then they were asked to, in whichever way they felt like as a group, rank these issues by importance. And so this was my main source of data. The blue cards are player generated. The yellow are ones that I pulled from my background in lit review. So the key finding here for me, oh, wait, real quick. Ignore this part, ignore the text. Look at the pictures. So after the gameplay, I also asked players to use these little person-shaped outlines to illustrate what they might think of themselves as a flood-resilient person, to do a portrait of themselves as somebody who could deal with flooding. And I got really awesome results. I think you can see there's Flood Batman. The superhero iconography came up and was really interesting. This one, I don't know if you can read it. This person imagined themselves as a flood superhero with sponges for hands to absorb the water, which is not very practical, but is fun. And then you had sort of like this example down here. This person was thinking about the material preparation, the equipment, the gear, the survivalist mindset. And then this person literally symbolized the support of their friends and family as a life preserver. So this sort of creative, nonverbal way to think about and approach these topics was really interesting for me to see, and I think also was a great process for the participants. And that sort of leads me to the benefits of this kind of approach if you ever end up doing something like this. First of all, like I mentioned, the game that I ended with for this process was completely different from the one that I started with, and that was because of the feedback that I got from players about it takes too long to explain the rules, it takes too long to set up this board, why can't we just use the cards? And I was like, yeah, good point. They actually fundamentally changed the methodology as it went on. So the game that the first group played is not the same game as the last. And importantly, because we want to avoid sort of that extractive process of data collection where communities don't get benefits from the work that we do. These gaming sessions were held in a queer-owned bar, so there was socialization, people got to laugh, they were having fun, they were making some crude jokes. So that was a big benefit to players. And it was actually really cool. The bar that I went to, when I asked them if I could do this, they got very excited and they let me hang flyers in their windows to promote it and do all of this stuff. So that was great. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time on some of the themes that came out of this from my thematic coding. The first one that showed up was from the gap cards that I got from players, from talking to them. There was a lot of distrust in sort of what you might call official, formal actors, government, NGOs, the private sector. And this was either because of concerns that they would explicitly be discriminatory, like the example with, a religious charity, or the instance where, oh, even if they want to help us, they just don't have the capacity, there's no funding. Why would we rely on that? And this became so pronounced, in fact, that on a couple of rounds of this game, I had players who, even when they had no other resources left, outright refused to play the emergency services card. And the rationale was, well, if it ends up being the cops that come, they're just going to make it worse. So really striking kind of tension there. And that leads me to the big argument that I want to make from sort of a theory standpoint. I went into this research with the question oriented around how to reduce queer vulnerability, and this was the wrong question. What I found was, because I saw how players were not reacting well to this association between queerness when understood as weakness, that led me to explore more feminist scholarship outside of disaster studies. So that pulled me into Butler and a few other folks. So one thing I really want to challenge all of us to think about, because this shows up a lot in disaster management policy, practice, because of that lovely pressure and release model from Wisner that tells us that social drivers are what create risk from natural hazards. A lot of our methods, I think, have started to sort of assume this inverse relationship between resilience and vulnerability, where if vulnerability goes down, resilience goes up. And this can be really well intentioned, but I think it also has a problem where the not vulnerable person is basically understood to be a default white able-bodied male. And we try to get people as close to that as possible. Other panels in this conference have talked about how development initiatives, especially in places like Southeast Asia, can have these unintended consequences of erasing livelihoods of diversity. So I want to challenge you to think about your assumptions about vulnerability and try to recognize, vulnerability is something that can be primordial and ontological. We are all vulnerable. We all get sick. We all die. But it can be a place that leads to harm. People can exploit that vulnerability and harm us. But that's also a place where that opens up opportunities to be helped and to make connections. And that's what some of the other scholarship here has shown too, is that it is through that recognition of vulnerability. Oh, you're hurting here, I'm also hurting here. That's where solidarity emerges. So an example of that would be the mutual aid and care collective networks of support that came out of the HIV/AIDS crisis. These were places where queer people were caring for each other, even when they themselves were vulnerable, outside the bounds of, and even sometimes in defiance of, the state. So that's a really important thing. And I think I've got a little bit of time left, but I just want to leave you with this idea that as we pursue climate adaptation, extreme weather adaptation, and resilience building initiatives, we want to keep in mind who that is intended for, where it's coming from, who's building those initiatives, because rejecting vulnerability in the pursuit of resilience, in sort of a utilitarian pursuit of minimize harm, minimize death without thinking about these other dimensions, can really flatten diversity and diminish livelihoods. And I don't think that is the direction we want to go to. That's a very neoliberal, patriarchal approach that comes from the same paradigms that got us into the climate crisis in the first place. So I think I will leave it there, save the rest for questions. Thanks. And then if you want my sources, I've got this little QR code. I know questions will come after the next presentation, but thank you.